This is our monthly virtual support group called Moving with MS. I partner with MS Views and News to host this monthly for you guys. I am a physical therapist and a multiple sclerosis certified specialist. It's always a mouthful to say that. And we talk about topics that relate to physical therapy and exercise and symptom management strategy. So, as you may guess, that is a broad topic. There's lots and lots of different presentations and topics that we've talked about. It's a different one every month, and this month it is analyzing your walking. This is the first time I have ever given this presentation. I've been making it over the last week or so I'm really excited to share it with you guys, get your feedback and get your thoughts. And as always, it is going to require some participation from you, so I'm excited to see what you guys have to say. So I have a few questions for you guys in the beginning before I share anything else with you, because I just want to get a sense of where you're at, how your walking is, what your goals are, and then I can tweak the presentation so that it fits you more specifically. So we're going to talk about gait abnormalities and requirements for good gait. I've got to move this, it's in the way. Okay. Gait abnormalities, requirements for good gait, analysis of walking and exercises. So we're going to go through all of the most common gait abnormalities, and we're going to review why they're happening and then exercises that you can do to improve it if you have that type of gait pattern, and then other contributing factors. So I have two questions for you guys to help us get started. Hey, Suzanne, I see you're on from Boston. So first question, what is the number one thing wrong with your walking? There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just curious as if you had to pick one thing, what do you feel, what limitation, what weakness or tightness, what is limiting you the most? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question in a bit. But again, there's no right or wrong answers. It could be something like not being able to lift your leg, not being able to bend your knee, not being able to lift your ankle, balance. If you had to pick one thing, what would it be? And the reality is it's probably a lot of things, and we're going to review that throughout. But I just want to see what you guys have to say. So Catherine says, my right leg just doesn't participate. Slow, standing straight, that's a good one. Foot drop, hip drop, lack of leg strength, no balance, knee doesn't bend normally, drop foot, unable to lift my leg, heavy, bend my knee, lift. Okay, so a bunch of people saying lifting your leg is the most challenging. Yeah, lifting the leg. Numbness, that's a good one. We're going to touch on that today. Slow, a few people talking about speed, balance, lifting, another person for lifting, another for balance. All right, so lifting and balance might be the most common. Fatigue, we're going to talk about that too. It's definitely a few people saying drop foot. All right, so the reason I ask this specific question is because sometimes, not all the time, but the majority of the time that I'm talking with a client, usually this happens one-on-one, is I will ask them, you know, what's your walking like? I won't look at them walking yet. I'll just say, what's your walking like? What's limiting you? And they'll give me an answer. And one client in particular, I'll never forget this conversation. She said, she's like, if I could just bend my knee, I'd be able to walk better. I know that I'd be able to walk better and that it would be so much easier if I could just bend my knee. I was like, okay, so we started brainstorming about some knee exercises, and then I watched her walk, and she was right. Bending her knee was a limitation, but it was the lifting of her leg. It was the hip flexors that was a bigger limitation. And if I hadn't watched her walk, she would continue thinking it was just her knee. And that's the power of being able to analyze your walking, because if you ever feel like you've been in a position where you feel like you're doing all the right things, like, you know, it's my knee that's weak, and you're doing tons of knee exercises and you're not seeing improvements, it could be the exercises that you're doing, but it also could be that, yes, your knee is limited, but your hip is more limited, or your ankle, or it's your balance, it's something else. So we're going to talk about all of that today, but that's why I think this question is so important. So my second question for you is, what is the number one goal that you have for your walking? And some of you guys already mentioned slow, so I assume speed might be one of your goals, but it could be, you know, walking a longer distance and therefore having more endurance. It could be walking faster. It could be walking at all. Maybe you're not walking at all right now. You just want to stand, or you just want to be able to take a few steps. You want to be able to move around in your home, go get the mail, go to and from work, be able to get to and from your car. What is your number one goal? Endurance. Ooh, walking without the walker. That's a good point too. Without any mobility aid or with a lesser mobility aid. Being able to walk for a longer duration, more safety, more endurance. Another person for without an assistive device. Use both legs when walking, longer distance, better balance. To not be housebound. To walk without fear of falling. Yeah, fear is a big one. Move from a rollator to a cane, more confident, yes. Walking without an assistive device, endurance, another assistive device, keeping balance, okay, so a lot of people saying endurance, a lot of people saying confidence, not feeling like you're gonna fall, being able to stand longer, walking without my walker. Okay, awesome. It's just helpful for me to know where you guys are at so that when I'm giving you the examples in this presentation, I can tweak it more towards your symptoms and your goals. So that was very helpful. Thank you for answering those. Okay, so gait abnormalities. And let me preface this by saying there are many. There's probably 15 that are very, very common. We don't have time today to review all of those. So I chose the 7 most common gait abnormalities, the most common way that people with MS will walk if they have weakness in a certain area or tightness in a certain area or poor balance, or there's lots of different things, and we'll review those as well. So if you know right off the bat that you have any of these, go ahead and put them in the chat because I can spend more time on the ones that you know you have trouble with. But what we're going to do is I'm going to demonstrate what each of these look like, and then we're also going to go into exactly what is causing it, because if you know what's causing it, you have a strategy then on how to improve it. So one thing that you will learn very quickly is that you might assume if you hip hike or hip drop or hip swing that it's a hip issue. Most of the time it's not, right? But you might assume that it is, and so you're doing all of these hip exercises, hip strengthening, hip stretching, and it's not improving. And it's because that, yes, that's a component, but there might be something else that is a stronger component for you. Same thing with foot drop, foot slap, foot drag. Those are all related to ankle weakness, and they have a similar strategy in terms of improving it. But if you're only focusing on foot and ankle exercises, it's going to take forever to actually see improvements in those gait abnormalities. And then walking like you're drunk is another one. So walking requirements. Actually, before I go to that, let me see what you guys said. Foot drop, hip drop, foot drop, walking like I'm drunk, 2 for walking like I'm drunk, all of them. Yeah, and that's a good point. You absolutely can have all of these. Foot drop, I've been told I hip hike and hip swing, foot drop, foot drag. Okay, so lots of people with foot drop and foot drag. Another foot drag, walking like I'm drunk. Okay. Awesome. So I can definitely spend some more time on that one. So walking requirements, this is another thing that is important when we're trying to analyze your gait, analyze walking, because a lot of people will focus on just one of these areas. For example, if you have spasticity, you might mostly focus on just flexibility, on just number 3. Or if you feel really weak, you might focus on just strengthening. Or a lot of you guys said balance was your biggest limitation. If you only focus on balance or only focus on just one of these categories, you're not going to get the type of improvement that you're looking for. So walking well or really at all requires decent strength, not perfect, not great, decent. Decent strength, decent balance, decent flexibility, decent range of motion, vision, if you have blurred vision, double vision, any vision changes, that will impact your walking. Sensation, if you can't feel your feet, if they're numb, tingling, less sensitive, pins and needles, that's going to impact your walking. Speed, a few of you guys mentioned slow. We need some level of speed, decent speed to walk well. And then we need decent endurance depending on what your goals are. So before we get to gait analysis, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I want to demonstrate for you guys what each of these look like, because some of you guys might not know what I'm talking about. So I want to demonstrate what they look like, and then we're going to review what causes each of them. And then if you need a refresher of demonstration, we can do that again at the end too. I see some people saying some stiffness, I need to strengthen, numbness, balance. Yeah, so let's get into the demonstration first. So I'm just going to move my things on my end so I can see. Okay, here we go. So the first one is hip hike. All right, make sure you can see me over here. Okay, so for this video demonstration, let's assume that this side of my body is the limited or weaker side, just the side that's causing problems. So for hip hike, I'm going to move this slightly further down. There you go. Okay, so we're assuming this is the side of my body that is causing limitations. So a hip hike would look something like this. And by the way, I'm going to really exaggerate for all of these so that you can see what's happening. You might have this condition, but not at the severity that I'm demonstrating it. So for hip hike, it would look like this: hike and down, up. And you really crunching your side together right here. Let me show you from a different angle. So again, it's this side. So it's when you're bringing this leg forward, you hike it up and down. When you're doing this, oftentimes your knee stays straighter. You're really condensing your back. So you might notice back pain if you walk this way, or side pain. So it's that hiking, like that. So that's what hip hike is. Hip drop is a very interesting one, but before we get into that, hip drop is when your leg drops and then you walk through and it drops. So hip drop is, it looks like it's the other side. So it's interesting because it's counterintuitive, but when one leg is weak, when this leg is weak, it causes a drop on this side. So you would walk like this. So if you feel like you've got this sway and one leg is just dropping, that is what hip drop is. Hip circumduction or hip swing is this. So you're just swinging it around. That's a really, really common one. Foot drop has lots of different forms. So I separated it into 3. Foot drop is when your foot doesn't lift either. I'm losing my balance here. It's when your foot doesn't lift at all or very little, and you just land with your toes. So instead of landing with your heel as you're moving forward, you might land on your toes or a flat foot. And so it might look something like this. You can't really see. I only got 2 steps in that one. So it's more like toes, toes, or flat foot. Like you can't really pick the leg up. You can't land with your heel. That would be foot drop. Foot slap is when you can land with your heel, but you hear a slap. If you can ever hear yourself walking, it's probably foot slap. So it look and sound something like this. It's this quick slap to the ground. Slap, 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 slap. You'll hear yourself, specifically when your toes slap. And then foot drag is when you have such little ankle strength that you can't even lift your ankle up at all, and you just drag your foot. Now, some people drag the whole way, other people just drag in the beginning and then you're good, or just drag at the end. So there's lots of different variations. Lastly, walking like you're drunk. So that would be potentially something like you're walking fine, but then you take a step out here or a step across. So it's just very unstable, uncoordinated walking. Sometimes it just looks like very narrow gait. So like you're walking on a tightrope, which is going to make you feel more off balance too. So those are the most common gait abnormalities in MS. There are others, but we're going to review why they happen and what you can do for them. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, you might have more than one. It's oftentimes not just one or the other. You can have foot drop and hip circumduction. You can have foot drop and hip hiking, or any combination. So hopefully that demonstration was helpful. All right, so now we're going to get into gait analysis. So again, when you analyze your gait, and oftentimes this is not you doing this to yourself, you can, it's much harder to do it to yourself, but what I do as a physical therapist, and if you go to a PT in person or even via telehealth, this is what they will do. Your neurologist does this as well, but not fully, because that's not their role. So what we look at is, what is your strength in your hip, knee, ankle, and core? What is your balance in double leg stance, single leg stance, and staggered stance? What is your flexibility in your hips, knees, and ankles? What is your range of motion in your hips, knees, and ankles? What is your vision, sensation, speed, and endurance? All of these are typically assessed at your very first session, because all of these play a role in our mobility. It's not just one or the other. Okay, so let's get into it. Hip hiking. And if in the let me know in the comments if you feel like you're someone with the hip hike. And then I'll know who I'm speaking to for this. So hip hike. Why? Why are you hiking your hip? This was the first one I demonstrated where your hip just kind of hikes up. It's the one where I mentioned where you might have a little bit of back pain or side pain because you're just lifting that leg up. You're overcompensating with your back muscles because your leg is weaker and or tighter. So the reason this is happening is because you can't, oops, back up here. There we go. Because you can't lift your leg, meaning your hip flexors are weak, so that marching movement is weak, or you can't bend your knee, that can cause hip hike, or you can't lift your ankle, or all three. So let me demonstrate this again. And before I do, let me just see. That did clarify a lot. Thank you. Awesome. Do you teach? I teach virtually like this, but nowhere else. Hip hike, okay, definitely very helpful. You have hip hike, hip hike. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my presentation again. I'm just a very visual learner, so I hope that it's helpful for you guys to see this stuff. Let me get out of here. Okay, so hip hiking, again, the reason that this can happen, so if you have hip hike, three most common reasons, there's lots, but three most common reasons this happens is because your hip flexors are weak. Your hip flexors are meant to lift your leg up like this. If you have weakness with that, you physically will not be able to clear the ground with your foot. So your brain says, oh, you can't do that? I can help you. If your foot is off the ground, you'll see my foot came off the ground just because I lifted my hip, not because I'm actually marching or bending my knee. Your foot will come off the ground if you do this. So when you do that, then you can bring your leg forward. So if your hip flexors are weak, that can cause hip hike. Also, if you can't bend your knee, one of the first movements we should do when we take a step forward is bend our knee and then march. So bending of your knee gets your foot off the ground. If you can't get your foot off the ground, you got to hike your hip up and then you can bring it forward. Lastly, if you can't lift your ankle, so if you can bend your knee a little, let's say you can bend it this much, but you can't get your toes up off the ground, Again, you've got to be able to get your leg off the ground. So if you can't get your leg off the ground by marching, bending your knee, or lifting your toes, you're going to hip hike. So those are the three common areas of weakness. Another reason for hip hike could be tightness in the opposing muscles. So for example, if you have weakness here, another thing that can cause that movement to be challenging is tightness on the backside. If you have weakness bending your knee, you might also have tightness on the front. If you can't lift your ankles, if you're weak doing that, you might have weakness on the front and tightness in the back on your calf. So what you can do if you have hip hike is our exercises to strengthen your hip flexors, your knee flexors, and your ankle dorsiflexors, as well as to stretch the opposite side. So stretching your glutes and hamstrings, stretching your quads, and stretching your calf muscles. The last thing that you can do if you have hip hike, and you'll notice this, I will mention this in all of the different gait abnormalities, the last thing that you can do is improve your single leg balance, even if you're using a mobility aid. The worse your balance is on one leg, the less time you have to move your leg forward. And if you have weakness and if you have tightness, you're going to need more time. That slows you down. So if you can't balance for 3 solid seconds on this leg, and it takes you 3 seconds to be able to bend your knee and move it forward, you're going to lose your balance. And then we go into the phase of walking like you're drunk or tripping or falling and not feeling confident. So you'll see a similar demonstration in a second. And by the way, I'm assuming we might have lots of questions. This is a lot of information all at once. It's a lot of exercises and strategies that you can utilize to help correct these types of gait abnormalities. I would highly encourage you watch the recording of this because I don't know how much time we'll have at the end for questions, but there's a lot of information in here and it's a lot of really good information. So you have lifetime access to this webinar, so please come back to it. Okay, so here we go. So we mentioned you can't lift your leg, your hip flexors, knee flexors, or ankle. So you want to strengthen your hip flexors and the knee flexors, stretch the opposing muscles, and practice balance. Okay, hip drop. Actually, I think I'm gonna come back to this one. Hip circumduction. The reason I want to skip to this is because it's very, very similar to the one that we just talked about. So I'll show you this, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll demonstrate. So why might you be hip swinging or hip circumducting? Because you can't bend your knee, or I shouldn't say can't, because bending your knee is difficult. Or lifting your leg is difficult. A bunch of you guys in the beginning said lifting your leg was the most challenging, or you can't lift your ankle. So basically the same things that we were just mentioning. So the strategy is going to be the same. You want to strengthen the bending part of your knee, strengthen the marching, stretch opposing muscles, and balance on both sides. But because I'm a visual learner, let's all watch a demonstration again. Hip swinging is when you come around like this. And when you think about it, most of the time that you hip swing, if you were to like freeze, like you tape yourself in a video and you freeze it when your leg is around, more times than not, your knee is straight. Very rarely, if ever, do I see someone hip swing, but their knee is bent. And so that's a huge indicator that one reason you're hip swinging is because you can't bend your knee enough to clear the ground. So if you can't clear the ground because your knee isn't bending, one easy way, swing it around. Similar to hip hike, if you can't march, your foot's going to get stuck on the ground. It's going to be really challenging, maybe even impossible. One easy way to bring your leg forward, if it's stuck on the ground here, bring it out to the side. It gets it off the floor and you swing around. And lastly, the ankle lifting. If you can bend your knee a little bit, but not enough to clear the ground, or maybe it does clear the ground, but slightly, like not enough for your toes to clear. Again, that's another indicator that you're probably either going to hip hike, as we've discussed, or go around. When you go around, it brings your leg up off the floor. So the reason this happens is because you can't bring your leg up off the floor, either via bending your knee, bending your hip, or bending your ankle. So it's going to be a very similar treatment strategy to if you have hip hike, because the problem is the same. You can't lift your leg up off the floor. So again, you would want to, for swinging, hip swinging, you'd want to focus on marching. So you want to focus on strengthening the hip flexors and stretching the back side. You want to focus on bending your knee, so using your knee flexors, and you want to focus on stretching the quads. If your quads are tight, it straightens your knee. So it's going to make it really challenging to bend that knee. So you want to stretch the front, and similar to what we mentioned before, you're going to want to strengthen the front of your ankle and stretch the back, so stretch the calf, all because it's that same issue of not being able to lift your leg up off of the floor. And there's no rhyme or reason as to why some people who can't lift their leg up will do hip hike and then others do the hip circumduction, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same thing that's causing it, and therefore you treat it in a similar way. If there's time at the end, I can go over more specifics on what I mean when I say you want to strengthen the hip flexors, strengthen the knee flexors. For now, this presentation, the main goal is that you know what to strengthen. The how is in a lot of our past webinars and in our future webinars too. But if there's time at the end, I can definitely demonstrate further, because when I say strengthen your hip flexors in March, you don't have to do that standing. You can do that lying down, you can recline, you can do it lying on your side when you're in bed or on a couch. There's lots of ways that you can modify so that you actually can do it. I see spasticity gets in the way. Yeah, so if you have spasticity or those tight muscles, that's the stretching of the opposing muscle. My right hip is higher than my left hip. Okay, so we're actually going to discuss that in a second here. Should I be strengthening my left hip flexors and stretching my right? It depends what you mean, Suzanne, when you say my right hip is higher than my left. Different muscles can cause that. That doesn't necessarily mean that your hip flexors are tight on one side but not on the other side, or strong or weak on one side or the other. It actually could potentially be your glutes. It could be your back muscles. It could be your side, like your core muscles. So that's a little too hard to say yes or no to. Visual learning is where it's at, absolutely. It's most noticeable when going up or down a curb. Yes, that's a great point, Debbie. So any gait abnormality will be most noticeable when you're in a more challenging situation. You might not notice any hip hike ever when you're walking, but a curb, you see it, or stairs, you see it. So any type of situation, or even like gravel or sand, if you're walking on a more uneven surface, you'll see it. So that's a good point. Just notice I'm not lifting my knees at all. Yeah, this isn't the point of the talk right now, but I will say, obviously every person with MS is different, but I've been treating people with MS, I've been specializing in MS for 7 years now, and the number one movement that people forget about, not on purpose, it's just really challenging, and so your brain and body just forget about it, and that makes things worse, is bending your knee. For most people, if you can improve bending your knee just slightly, not a lot, just slightly, a cascade of events can happen where then your marching becomes easier, your ankle lifts become easier, and it's more in depth than that. But if I were to really generalize things, that bending of your knee is so important and not thought about. If you're just walking, we often don't think about bending our knee. We just think about marching and our toes. We want to lift those up. We forget about it. I could go off on a tangent for that, but I will not. All right, so let's go back to the one before. So hip drop. This one, as I mentioned earlier, is a little bit interesting because it's not the leg that you'd think it would be. And also, it's not your hip flexors. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes, and most of the time, that people have a gait abnormality that is associated with their hip, like your hip is dropping. People assume they need to strengthen their hip flexors, the front of their hip. But especially in hip drop, that is not the case. It is not a hip flexor issue at all. It's an outside. It's your glutes, it's your piriformis, it's your abductors, because when those muscles are weak, that causes that drop. Another name for this, if you're in the PT or OT or healthcare world at all, you may have heard this being called the Trendelenburg gait. That is the same thing as hip drop. So I will demonstrate this again, but just for those that like the visual of the words, you want to strengthen your glutes, your abductors, the outer side. I like to use the clamshell exercise for that, but there's lots. You could do sidestepping, standing kickbacks, seated kickbacks, sideline kickbacks. You want to stretch the opposing muscle, which is your inner thighs, and you want to practice balancing, of course, because the longer you can balance, the more time you have to bring your leg forward without the limitation. So hip drop. Okay, so again, this one's kind of tricky, and I always have to think about it when I'm saying it because it's opposite of what you'd think. So when this hip drops, it's this side that is actually weak. This side's glute, abductors, this job, when you're standing on that leg, is to stay in. If you have weakness here, your hip pops out and this side drops down. So if you walk like this, and I don't know if I mirror image to you or not, but this is my right side of my body. So if when you walk, your hip drops, your right hip drops, it's actually your left glutes, it's your left abductors, it's the left side that's poking out. That's the weaker side. So we want to strengthen here and get that back in. It's not actually this side that's the problem. It's the side that's poking out. So the reason that happens, why you'd be dropping, is because of weakness here. So again, one of my favorite exercises seated would be the seated clamshell exercise. You want to strengthen the outside. You could even do like side stepping, both ways, of course. Kickbacks, there's lots of things you could do. But remember, so we're strengthening the outside, so we're stretching the opposing, so we're stretching the inside. The tighter your inner thighs are, the more you'll have knee kissing, but also the more you might walk like a scissor gait, where your legs cross one another, or the more you might walk just really narrow. And those can make all types of hip drop worse. It makes your balance worse. So stretching the inside of your thigh, one of my favorite ways is to spread your knees as wide as you can and hold here. If you can even lean forward. So that's what hip drop is all about. That's why it happens and what you'd want to do to improve it. All right, so moving on from our hip, and let me see if there's anything first in the chat. For legs swinging, would that require intense therapy to correct if you've been swinging it for a few years? So for all of these, it will take a long time. If you have been walking in a certain way for years, it could take years to fix it. It doesn't necessarily require intense therapy. It requires consistency. But I will also say, if you've been walking this way for years, it's very possible that it could just take a few months to see an improvement. That gets us to the topic of neuroplasticity. If you have neural pathways going from your brain all the way down to the muscles that we're talking about, your hip flexors, your knee flexors, the hip abductors, if you have neural pathways there, they're just weaker or weakened from the demyelination, but they're still there and they're still working, you might see improvements within a few months for sure. And maybe even a significant improvement where you're walking differently within a year. But if those neural pathways are extremely weakened to the point where they are not working, with every repetition that you practice these exercises, your brain is trying to find a new neural pathway, a new way to get from point A to point B. That's going to take longer. That's more of that several years. But research shows it's possible, and it takes consistency over and over and over again. One thing that we'll talk a little bit about at the end, but I'll mention it now because it's fitting, is yes, these exercises are important, but another extremely important piece to improving your walking and analyzing your walking is also practicing walking with good quality. If you're in my Missing Link program, if you're a Missing Link member, you know exactly what I'm talking about. One thing that you must do is implement these things into your day when possible. So if you have time, if you're rushing to the bathroom, that is not the time to practice your good walking or your marching. If you are rushing to work or you're, whatever the situation, if you're rushing, not the time. But if you have time, if you've got to spare 30 seconds, you've got to spare 2 to 3 minutes, practice walking with exaggerated marching, exaggerated leg kicks, exaggerated ankle lifting, or put it all together and the whole thing is exaggerated. You have to practice implementing what you're strengthening into real life situations. I feel safer going sideways downstairs. Yep. Stumping on toes. So yeah, we're about to get into foot drops, so we'll talk about that. Work on bending the knee. Yes. Piriformis strengthening, yeah. Okay, so I grouped foot drop, foot slap, and foot drag all into one because it's all related to the same thing. The reason that it causes different symptoms is based on your level of endurance that you have in that muscle or lack of endurance, and when you're able to activate the muscle. Some people can activate it initially and then it just falls down. Other people have a difficult time activating it initially, hence the foot drag, but they're okay at the end. So there's a lot of different variations, but the reason for foot drop, foot slap, foot drag is all the same. It is weakness in the front of your ankle and tightness in the back of your ankle. That's it. But there are ways that we can compensate. So you'd want to strengthen the front of the ankle and stretch the opposing. So stretch the back and then of course balance on both sides. So let's demonstrate this one because a lot of you guys said that foot drop was one of your biggest symptoms. Okay, so let me change. I will say for ankle-based exercises, I prefer to do them seated because it takes balance out of the equation. It's easier. And if it's easier, you can do more with good quality. And if you can do more with good quality, that's more opportunities for neuroplasticity to train our brain. So I'm going to do these exercises seated. Okay. So let me demonstrate first. So again, like foot drag would be you're just dragging your foot either the whole way or you lift, but it's just at the end you're dragging, or maybe you are able to lift your leg, but you just land on your toes or the flat part of your foot, or foot slap. So it's that just heavy slap, 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 slap. Regardless, it's due to weakness in the front and tightness in the back. So one of my favorite exercises is practicing lifting up and down. You can do one side at a time if you'd like, and down. Make sure it's good quality. You don't want any angling one way or the other. And then just stretch the back. I should have grabbed a cane or something. Your leg goes out straight. You try to get your toes up. That's probably going to be challenging considering you have foot drop, foot slap, or foot drag. So use a cane, or a leg lifter, a dog leash, a bathrobe belt. Use something to help your ankle stay up. Sit up tall and hinge forward. And you should feel this stretch on the back side of your calf. There's millions of other different positions to do calf stretches in. If you have a different preference, go for it. The moral of the story is you want to stretch the calf and strengthen the front. However, that can take a while. As we recently reviewed with neuroplasticity, that might take a few months to improve or a year to improve. So if you have foot drop, even though your weakness is in the ankle and your tightness is in the calf, we can utilize your knee and your hip to compensate in a good way. So you're doing those exercises, you're working hard, you're trying to be consistent with them, but in the meantime, the more you can bend your knee, the more clearance you're getting from the ground. So you can still have foot drop, but if you can, the more you bend your knee and the more you can march. I'm not lifting my ankle at all right now. It's completely floppy, but that's okay. I didn't foot drag. I didn't foot slap because my knee is bent enough and my hip is marching enough. And then it would still likely land on your toes or flat foot, but it would at least be controlled. So while you are focusing on strengthening your hips, strengthening your ankle, stretching your ankle, you can also be focusing on bending your knee as an exercise. You can focus on marching as an exercise, because even though that's not directly related to your ankle, it can compensate. It can help you improve your walking so that your foot slap, foot drag, or foot drop doesn't affect you as much, therefore causing safer walking and more confidence. Okay. Doing good on time, I think. How many slides we got? Oh, we're doing good. Okay, that's good. All right, there's a question, could Bioness and or Psionic sleeve help correct that? Yes, we're gonna talk about that in a second. What is next? How do I do clamshells? We can save exercises for the end. This question is, how do I do clamshells when my bent knee won't lift? The clamshell doesn't require lifting, so I'm not sure I understand that question. A lot of people saying they have foot drag. I wrap a towel around my, towel. So when you're doing the calf stretch, any form of a non-stretchy strap or item will work. You can use a resistance band, but it's not going to be the most effective way. So something that's not stretchy. Walking like you're drunk. So a bunch of you guys said that this is something that you noticed as well. So walking like you're drunk is due to poor proprioception, knowing and balance. So knowing where you are in space. So this might also be called unstable gait, wobbly gait, scissor gait. As I demonstrated earlier, it's just unstable. You're walking, your foot lands where you didn't mean for it to land. So one reason, you're too off balance. You don't have enough balance to allow that one leg to move forward. As we talked about earlier, if you can't balance on one leg, you have a limited amount of time to get your opposite leg through, even with a mobility aid. So even if you are using a rollator or a cane or one or two trekking poles, if you're using that and standing on one leg and it's still not good balance, the more off balance you are, the less time you can stand on one leg for, with or without a mobility aid, the less time you have to move another leg forward, meaning it's probably going to land somewhere that you didn't mean for it to land because it just had to touch the ground. Because if you didn't touch the ground, you would have fallen. So that's a huge reason. Another reason that surprisingly doesn't have anything to do with balance is poor proprioception. Your body, your brain, your nerves, it doesn't know where your limb is in space. And so it's hard to land somewhere if you don't know where you are. For example, the same thing happens with our hands. If I'm trying to touch my nose, but I can't really sense where my hand is in space, I might end up over here or here. I don't know where my arm is, especially if my eyes are closed. So especially if you're walking in a dim lighting, or not that you'd ever walk with your eyes closed, but if you're walking at nighttime or you're not looking down at your feet, you're looking forward, that's going to make it even worse. So you want to practice balance and practice foot placement. So for walking like you're drunk, walking like this uncoordinated, your leg, it might be every step, or maybe it's just once in a blue moon where your leg will fall over here and then you're back on track and you're good. Or your leg will land in front and then you're good to go. Regardless, it can be due to either poor balance on one side. So for example, if this is the leg that we notice is falling out or falling in, one potential cause is weakness or poor balance on this side. So if I can't stand here long enough, naturally, we got to put it down. Because if you don't put it down, you're going to fall over. So it's going to land wherever it can to help prevent you from falling down. So practicing single leg balance, of course, with a mobility aid or something to help you. And if bending your knee is too challenging, keep it straight, but lift it out to the side, back. You could stand on a step and have this out, but you want to practice standing on one leg with or without a mobility aid. And make sure your knee is slightly bent. You don't want it to be locked straight. The other reason that this could happen is poor proprioception. Your brain doesn't know where your leg is in space. So it knows you need to move it forward, but it doesn't know where it is. So it's just going to cross here, or it's just going to go out to the side. So my favorite exercise to train for this is I call it a cone tap exercise. But you don't need a cone, you just need anything that you can touch. So let me show an example. What else do I have? We'll use this, hopefully you can see it. So I'm gonna show you an example with my water bottle and with my phone charger. So the higher the item, the harder it is, the lower the item, the easier it is. So if I have my high water bottle there, you see that? Put it here. I would want to practice, hold on to something for balance, but I would want to practice tapping that with my heel. I am training my brain that I want my leg to go there. And that is exactly where my leg is going. You want to practice that over and over again. But as we've been talking about, if marching is really challenging for you, that's going to be really challenging. Use a smaller item. Hopefully you can see this on this rug, and it's not the best color, but use something smaller. Tap here, and you're trying to tap with your heel. That's what good quality would be. If that's even too challenging, pick a spot on your rug. I've got this like pink spot right here. I'm gonna just pick that. You could even do it seated, same spot. And you're just practicing touching that exact spot. The smaller the spot, the better. If you have a big surface, like if I'm just going for anywhere on the rug, it's not specific enough. The way to work proprioception is with a very specific point of contact. All right. Okay, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to keep going, but maybe we'll have another presentation to go into more details with some of these. So other contributing factors, as I mentioned in the beginning, sensation is huge. If you have numbness, tingling, burning, pins and needles, hypo sensation, so you can't feel your feet as much, or even hyper sensation, if you can't feel the ground as well as what you used to, or even normally, then that is going to impact your walking. If you can't feel the ground, your brain is not getting the correct messages. Your brain can't tell that you're not bending your knee enough because you can't even feel the ground. Your brain can't tell that you're not marching, you're not lifting your leg enough because it can't even feel it. It doesn't know where it's landing because you can't even feel it. So there's strategies that you can do. We had a whole talk one time where we mentioned sensation and different strategies. One quick one that I'll mention now, get a bucket. Or someone recently gave me the idea of a Ziploc bag, which I love that idea. Get a Ziploc bag or a bucket, put a ton of dried rice in there, maybe even some dried beans, some dried corn kernels, throw it all in, put your foot in there, move it all around. If you have the strength, try to pick it up with your feet down, and you're just trying to desensitize your foot. So that's one of many strategies you could use. Speed is another one. If you're working on improved speed, you would do the same exercises, the same strengthening exercises that we talked about today, but do them faster. So if you want to be marching your leg faster, practice it doing it faster. Speed is a completely different form of exercise than strengthening. So just because you're strong doesn't mean you can move fast. You need to train for speed. If you don't, your speed will not improve. Same with endurance. Endurance is completely different than strength. It's different from speed. So if you want to walk a longer distance, walk for more minutes, you have to practice doing that. Other contributing factors, heat and cold intolerance. So sometimes it's due to strength, it's due to weakness, it's due to balance, all these things we've talked about thus far. But sometimes it's due to something that's out of our control. If you're overheating, that can affect your walking. If you're too cold for some people, that can affect your walking. If you're fatigued, better believe that's going to affect your walking. If you're in pain, if you have other injuries, if you have, especially if maybe you are a foot dragger, if you have toe pain, that's going to affect your walking. If you are, maybe you even just did a lot of exercise and your core is tired, that can affect your exercise. If you had a hip replacement, like anything, there's so many things that also contribute to poor walking and gait abnormalities unrelated to MS. And it's very likely that you might have one of those as well. So lastly, helpful tools, there's so many. This is just a very small list, but AFOs is an ankle foot orthosis. That is something that can help improve the strength and mobility of lifting your ankle up. So that can help with lots of the gait abnormalities. Braces like the Dictus band, the Elevate 360, the foot up, it's kind of similar to an AFO, but it's more of an ankle brace. I consider them different categories, but the goal is the same. The goal is to lift the ankle up. One that I didn't put on here that I see someone asked a question about, which is the BioNess, the Walk Aid, the Psionic Neural Sleeve, the Newbie, any type of electrical stimulation can be another helpful tool. So that can be something that you try as well. For sensation, the company Naboso is my favorite company. They have lots of different products like socks, a platform, shoe insoles, now I'm blanking, but lots of things to help improve the sensation of your feet while you're moving so that you feel your feet more. And then lastly, shoes. One of my favorite shoes, shoe wear for the last year and a half has been Kizik, because they're advertised as hands-free. I should have brought a pair up here. I don't have them right now, but you just slide into them. You don't need your hands. You don't need to bend over, meaning you don't need hip flexion strength. You don't need balance. You don't need to bend your knee. It's just sliding your foot in. So those are helpful tools so that you can improve your mobility even before you have the strength and the flexibility and balance and endurance that you're focusing on, that we've talked about so far. As you guys know by now, these are all of the ways that you can find me: my email, my website for The Missing Link, my podcast, my Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. I also have an app, but I ran out of space on here, called The Missing Link. Is it best, I'll answer as many questions as I can with the time we have left. Is it best to practice single leg balance, bending knee, with knee forward or with foot back? If I'm understanding this question correctly, it doesn't really matter. And any way that you can get into a single leg balance stance is fine. Strengthening the ankle and calf is exactly what I need. Awesome. So someone asked, how can I watch this again? I believe Jennifer from MS Views and News sends out the recording, but I think I have a link. If you go to YouTube and go to MS Views and News page, that's where you'll be able to find these recordings. You are very pleasant to listen to. Thank you. Thank you so much. You're welcome, Helene. Do these sessions yes, these are recorded, and you can watch them. Sometimes it takes a few days or a week or so to get them up, but they will be up on the MS Views and News YouTube page. Tap with the heel rather than the toe. Yes. I'm being a little bit picky when I suggest tapping with the heel, but yes, if you are tapping with your heel, you are training for dorsiflexion. You're training to lift your ankle. If you're tapping with your toe, you're training your brain that every time you walk, you want to land with your toe, which we do not. That's going to cause a trip, a fall. When you land, you want to land with your heel. So with that exercise, you want to practice tapping with your heel. I love your energy. Thank you. I have right leg weakness and stiffness and right foot drop. Is it normal to walk with a cane held on the left hand? So generally speaking, if you have the hand strength and dexterity, and if you're using a single mobility aid, like a single cane, a single trekking pole, you want that to be on the opposite side of your weaker leg. Or another way to think of it, it should be on your strong side. Because when you have your weak leg forward, your opposite hand should be forward. So if you're weaker on your right side, your left hand should have the cane. So yes, that is correct. If that's suitable for you, that is textbook correct. But some of my clients, I have them walk that way, but for years they've been walking a different way, and it's very uncomfortable for them and they feel unsafe, or they don't have the hand strength to hold the cane on that side. The last brand, Kizik, maybe, K-I-Z-I-K. I find a wrap around hip brace has helped me walk better. Yeah, hip braces. I hope you had a great Easter. Thank you. That was a great hour. Awesome. Okay, a bunch of people saying thank you. I agree. Very pleasant to listen to. Today's session was the best. Yay! I was so excited to give you this presentation. Again, I've never given it before, so it seems like we were about to do it in the hour mark. So good timing there. Do you recommend a vibration plate? That definitely can be another option. Didn't include that on my list, but not intentionally. Yeah, you could definitely try that. You are so amazing. Thank you for always hitting the nail on the head. You're welcome. Awesome. All right. Well, those are all the questions. Thank you so much for joining, and not only that, but for participating. And I will see you guys next month. We meet the second Monday of every month. So I will see you then. Have a great night, guys. Thanks again.